the 17th of January 1941, Fort Snelling, Minnesota. The thermometer outside the Quartermasters depot reads 12 degrees below zero. Inside the warehouse, a young sergeant named Arthur Brennan stands before a wooden crate stamped U.S. Army, Winter Issue 1918. His breath clouds in the unheated air. He pries open the lid with a crowbar, and the nails shriek against frozen wood. Inside, wrapped in oiled paper gone brittle with age, lie wool overcoats designed for the trenches of France, thick, heavy, soaked through with camphor and the musty scent of a war already 23 years dead. Brennan lifts one coat. The fabric is stiff as canvas. He holds it to the dim light filtering through frost-caked windows and sees the holes where moths have feasted. This is what the United States Army calls Arctic equipment in the winter of 1941. This is what they will send men to war in, should war come. And war, though not yet declared, is already whispering its arrival in the frozen winds sweeping down from Canada. The problem is not new, but it has been forgotten. Between the wars, while Europe rearmed and Japan carved its empire across Asia, the United States Army shrank to a constabulary force scattered across distant posts. Budget cuts hollowed out supply depots. Research ceased. The institutional memory of winter warfare, of frostbite and trench foot, of men losing fingers to cold before they ever faced an enemy, faded into filing cabinets and the minds of aging veterans. By 1941, the Army's winter doctrine is a relic, its gear is obsolete, and the men tasked with clothing and equipping a rapidly expanding force are scrambling to relearn lessons their predecessors learned in blood on the frozen ridges of the Meuse-Argonne. Fort Snelling is one of several depots where quartermasters are taking stock of what they have and confronting what they do not. The inventory is grim. Wool overcoats from the Great War, yes, thousands of them, rotting in storage. Wool trousers, wool blankets, wool everything, because wool was what they knew in 1918. But no insulated boots. No layered cold weather systems, no windproof outer shells. No gloves designed for temperatures below zero that still allow a man to operate a rifle. The United States Army in 1941 is prepared to fight the last war, not the next one. And the next one, as the quartermasters are beginning to understand, will be fought in climates their predecessors never imagined. This is the story of how a nation unready for winter war taught itself to survive the cold. It is a story without glory, without battles, without the thunder of guns. It is a story of wool and leather, of thermometers and test subjects, of bureaucrats and scientists racing against time and ignorance. It is the story of men like Arthur Brennan, who opened crates and found them wanting, and of the thousands of anonymous soldiers who would freeze in those early months because their country had not yet learned how to keep them warm. But it is also the story of transformation of an institution that, humbled by its own unpreparedness, rebuilt itself into the most logistically capable military force the world had ever seen. And it begins, as so many American stories do, with failure. The United States entered the First World War in April 1917 with an army of barely 100,000 men and emerged 18 months later with 4 million under arms. The logistical achievement was staggering, but it was also chaotic. Uniforms were procured in haste. Equipment was borrowed from the French and British. Standards were improvised. When American soldiers reached the Western Front in the winter of 1917, they wore what could be produced quickly, not what worked best. The wool overcoat became the symbol of that compromise, heavy enough to provide warmth in a static trench, but cumbersome, water-absorbent, and poorly suited to mobile warfare. Still, it worked well enough in France, where winters were cold but not extreme, where supply lines were short, and where men spent weeks in the same muddy positions. The coat kept them alive, and so it became doctrine. After the war, doctrine calcified. The army kept the overcoat, the wool trousers, the leather boots. It kept them not because they were ideal, but because they were familiar, because they were cheap, because changing them would require research and investment that a peacetime Congress would not authorize. The Quartermaster Corps, responsible for clothing and equipping the force, became a repository of tradition rather than a laboratory of innovation. Its officers studied logistics, not physiology. Its depots stockpiled surplus, not solutions. And when the world began sliding toward war again, in the late 1932, when the army began planning for conflicts that might stretch from the Arctic to the tropics, the Quartermaster Corps found itself intellectually and materially unprepared. The problem revealed itself in pieces. In 1939, the army conducted winter maneuvers in upstate New York. Men wearing standard-issue wool overcoats and leather boots were exposed to temperatures in the teens. Within hours, cases of frostbite began appearing. Soldiers reported that their boots, designed for temperate climates, provided no insulation against frozen ground. The overcoats, when wet from snow or sweat, became leaden weights that sapped body heat rather than preserving it. Gloves were too thick to allow fine motor control, too thin to prevent numbness. The lessons were clear, but the response was slow. Maneuvers were exercises, not emergencies. The army took notes and moved on. But by 1940, exercises were giving way to reality. Germany had invaded Poland and then Norway, demonstrating that modern war could be fought in sub-zero conditions with mechanized speed. The Soviet Union had invaded Finland and suffered catastrophic losses in the Winter War, not only from Finnish bullets, but from cold that froze diesel fuel, immobilized tanks, and killed men in their sleep. If the United States was drawn into this widening conflict, its soldiers might fight in Russia, in Scandinavia, in the Aleutian Islands. They might fight in mountains and forests where winter was not an inconvenience but a weapon wielded by nature itself. And they would need more than moth-eaten wool coats to survive. The Quartermaster Corps began its education in earnest. Officers were dispatched to study cold-weather clothing used by civilian expeditions by Arctic explorers, by Canadian trappers, by ski patrol units in the Rockies. They learned that the key to cold-weather survival was not a single heavy garment, but a layered system, an inner layer to wick moisture away from the skin, a middle layer to insulate, an outer layer to block wind and repel water. They learned that boots needed insulation built into the sole and space enough for thick socks without constricting circulation. They learned that gloves needed to be modular, a thin inner glove for dexterity, a thick outer mitten for warmth. These were not revolutionary ideas. Civilians had known them for decades. But the army had to rediscover them, had to test them, had to translate them into specifications that could be mass-produced by contractors who had never made anything but wool uniforms. The research was painstaking. Test subjects, soldiers volunteered or assigned, were sent into cold chambers and onto frozen training grounds wearing prototype garments. Their body temperatures were monitored. Their performance was measured. They were asked to march, to dig, to fire weapons, to perform the tasks of war while encased in experimental layers of cotton, wool, and a new synthetic material called nylon that most of them had never heard of. Some of the designs worked, many did not. A parka that kept a man warm while standing still might overheat him during exertion, soaking the inner layers with sweat that would freeze when he stopped moving. Boots that fit comfortably in a warm warehouse might cut off circulation when worn in sub-zero temperatures, leading to frostbite despite their insulation. Every failure was a lesson, and every lesson was purchased with the discomfort of men who tested the gear in conditions that mimicked the wars to come. But research takes time, and time was a luxury the army did not have. In September 1940, Congress passed the Selective Service Act, and the armed forces began expanding at a rate unseen since 1917. Hundreds of thousands of men flooded into training camps. They needed uniforms immediately, not in 6 months or a year. The Quartermaster Corps fell back on what it had: the old wool overcoats, the leather boots, the inadequate gloves. They issued them because there was nothing else to issue, knowing full well that these items would fail in extreme cold, hoping that the war would not come to the Arctic before better equipment could be produced. The hope was misplaced. The 7th of December, 1941. The world shifts. When Japanese bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, the United States was thrust into a two-ocean war that would test every assumption and expose every weakness. Within weeks, American forces were fighting in the Philippines, in North Africa, and in the frigid waters of the North Atlantic. Within months, they would be in the Aleutian Islands, where Japanese forces had seized the islands of Attu and Kiska, and where American soldiers would experience cold more punishing than anything they had trained for. The quartermasters had been right to worry. Their worst predictions were coming true. The Aleutian campaign, though small in scale compared to the great battles in Europe and the Pacific, became a crucible for American cold-weather doctrine. The islands were wind-swept rocks jutting from the Bering Sea, shrouded in fog and lashed by storms. Temperatures hovered near freezing even in summer. In winter, they plunged well below zero, and the wind made it feel colder still. The terrain was treeless tundra and volcanic rock, offering no shelter, no firewood, no respite. It was a landscape designed to kill, and it did so with ruthless efficiency. The first American troops sent to reclaim the islands in 1943 arrived wearing the standard wool uniform and leather boots. They were cold within hours and frostbitten within days. The boots, still the same design issued in 1918, soaked through in the wet tundra and froze solid at night. Men had to sleep with their boots inside their sleeping bags to keep them pliable enough to put on in the morning. The wool overcoats, heavy with moisture, provided little warmth. Gloves were inadequate. Soldiers improvised by stuffing newspaper into their boots, by wrapping their hands in rags, by huddling together for warmth. They fought the Japanese, but they fought the cold more. Medical reports from the campaign are a litany of preventable suffering. Trench foot, a condition caused by prolonged exposure to cold and wet, afflicted thousands. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Cases of hypothermia filled field hospitals. In some units, cold weather injuries outnumbered combat casualties by a wide margin. Men who survived firefights were evacuated because they could no longer walk, their feet blackened and swollen, their bodies racked with fever. The failure was not one of courage or tactics. It was a failure of preparation, a failure to equip soldiers with the tools they needed to survive the environment in which they were ordered to fight. The lessons learned in the Aleutians were harsh and immediate. Reports flooded back to the Quartermaster Corps, demanding better boots, better gloves, better everything. But by then, production lines were already retooling. The research that had begun in 1940 was finally bearing fruit. New designs were being tested, refined, and rushed into production. The iconic M1943 field jacket, with its windproof outer shell and button-in liner, was being distributed. Insulated boots with rubber soles and leather uppers shoe packs were being manufactured by the tens of thousands. Layered glove systems were being issued. Slowly, painfully, the army was learning how to dress for winter war. But the transformation was incomplete. Even as new equipment reached some units, others still wore the old wool coats. Supply chains, strained by the demands of a global war, struggled to deliver gear to the right places at the right times. In the winter of 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, American soldiers once again found themselves fighting in brutal cold, many without adequate winter clothing. The surprise German offensive caught units unprepared, and the quartermaster depots in the rear had not yet distributed the new cold-weather gear widely. Men fought in frozen forests with wet feet and numb hands, enduring conditions that should have been preventable. The old failures reasserted themselves, a grim reminder that logistics, not just valor, wins wars. Yet even in that chaos, the progress was undeniable. The soldiers who did have the new gear, the M1943 jackets, the insulated boots, the layered gloves, performed better, suffered fewer cold-weather injuries, and maintained higher morale. The difference was stark. Units with proper equipment could sustain operations in sub-zero temperatures. Units without it could not. The lesson was clear. Cold weather warfare was not a matter of toughness or endurance alone. It was a matter of science and supply, of understanding how the human body loses heat and providing the tools to prevent it. By 1945, the United States Army had become proficient at cold weather operations. It had not mastered them. Mastery would come later, in Korea and beyond, but it had learned the fundamentals. The Quartermaster Corps had transformed from an institution clinging to obsolete traditions into one capable of innovation and adaptation. Its officers had studied not just logistics but physiology, not just supply chains but survival. They had worked with scientists and engineers to develop equipment that could withstand extremes. They had established cold weather testing facilities where new designs could be evaluated before they reached the field. They had built a system. The transformation was not glamorous. There were no medals for the men who designed better boots, no monuments to the quartermasters who coordinated the distribution of winter gear across 3 continents. But their work saved lives. It allowed American soldiers to fight in Norway and northern Italy, in the frozen forests of Belgium and the Hurtgen, in the mountains of Korea 5 years later. It gave the United States a capability that, in 1941, it had utterly lacked: the ability to sustain military operations in the coldest places on Earth. The symbolic object in this story is not a weapon or a flag. It is a boot. A simple, insulated boot, with a rubber sole and a leather upper, designed to keep feet dry and warm in sub-zero temperatures. It is an object so mundane that soldiers took it for granted, so essential that its absence could cripple an army. The boot represents not American firepower or industrial might, but something quieter and more fundamental: the commitment to care for the individual soldier, to study his needs, to provide him with the tools to survive. It represents the belief that wars are not won by sending men into the cold to suffer and die, but by giving them the means to endure so they can fight. In 1941, America had no such boots. It had wool coats from 1,918 and a Quartermaster Corps that did not yet understand the science of staying warm, but it learned. It learned from failure, from frostbite, from the frozen toes of soldiers who had trusted their country to prepare them. It learned because it had to, because the world was at war, and the cold would not wait for better planning. And in learning, it built something enduring: a system of knowledge and capability that would outlast the war and define American military logistics for generations. The frozen lesson of 1941 is not a story of triumph but of transformation. It is a story of a nation that, confronted with its own ignorance, chose to educate itself. It is a story of bureaucrats and scientists, of test subjects and supply sergeants, of men who shivered in cold chambers so that other men would not freeze on distant battlefields. It is a story without heroes in the traditional sense, because the heroes are anonymous: the quartermaster who requisitioned better gloves, the researcher who tested layered fabrics, the soldier who reported that his boots were failing and demanded something better. But it is also, in a deeper sense, a story about American pragmatism and adaptability. The United States entered the war unprepared in many ways, not just in cold weather gear, but in armor, in aircraft, in doctrine. It stumbled, improvised, and learned. It made mistakes, corrected them, and moved forward. The cold weather failure of 1941 was one of many early failures, but it was met with the same response that characterized the American war effort: a willingness to admit error, to study the problem, and to fix it. There is a broader truth embedded in this story, one that extends beyond boots and coats. It is the truth that freedom and democracy are not sustained by ideology alone, but by competence, by the ability to organize, to produce, to adapt, by the commitment to care for the people who serve, to see them not as expendable resources but as individuals whose survival matters. The quartermasters who relearned winter warfare in 1941 were not philosophers or poets. They were logisticians. But in their work, there was a kind of quiet idealism. the belief that every soldier's life was worth the effort to protect, that no detail was too small if it meant the difference between survival and death. And so, in the end, the frozen lesson is this: preparedness is not a luxury, but a moral obligation. Ignorance is not excusable when lives are at stake, and the willingness to learn, to change, to admit what you do not know, and seek the answers, that willingness is what separates a nation that endures from one that falters. In the winter of 1941, the United States Army did not have Arctic gear, but it had the capacity to recognize its failure and the determination to overcome it. That capacity, more than any weapon, more than any strategy, was what allowed America to fight and win in the coldest corners of the earth. Epilogue. Decades later, long after the last veteran of the Aleutians has passed, the insulated boot remains standard issue. It has been refined, improved, tested in new wars and new climates, but its lineage traces back to those desperate years when quartermasters opened crates and found them wanting. It is a small thing, a boot, but it carries within it the memory of frozen feet, of lessons learned too late, of a nation that stumbled into war unprepared and emerged with the knowledge that preparation begins long before the first shot is fired. The cold does not care about ideology. It does not distinguish between the righteous and the wicked, the prepared and the foolish. It simply is a force of nature indifferent to human ambition. But how a nation responds to the cold, how it prepares its people to face it, how it learns from its failures that reveals something essential about its character. In 1941, America was not ready for winter war, but it became ready. One boot, one coat, one lesson at a time. And in that transformation lies a truth that transcends any single war, that the strength of a democracy is measured not by its perfection, but by its willingness to improve. Not by what it knows, but by what it is willing to learn. Not by the battles it wins, but by the care it takes to bring its people home alive. The thermometer outside Fort Snelling still drops below zero every January. The warehouse still stands, though it houses different supplies now, different wars. But somewhere in its records, in yellowed requisition forms and faded inventory lists, is the ghost of that moment when a sergeant opened a crate and understood, with the clarity that only failure brings, that his country had forgotten how to fight the cold. And somewhere in the mountains and the forests, in the places where soldiers still train for winter war, is the legacy of his realization, the knowledge that warmth, like freedom, must be defended. That survival, like democracy, requires preparation. That the cold, like tyranny, must be met not with bravado but with science, not with ideology but with competence. That a boot, well made and properly insulated, can be an instrument of care, and that care, in the end, is the quiet foundation on which all great nations stand.